tech workers? Thank you. Yeah. So just FYI, this call is being recorded. It's going up on YouTube. We want to make this information ex as accessible to as many people as possible. So thanks for joining us today. Let's do a little level setting, a little introduction. We all know we're all here because we know that ICE is in our communities. The past, many months, the level of activity by Customs and Border Control, by ICE, has been rapidly increasing. Our neighbors, our friends, families are being surveilled and kidnapped by mass federal agents, detained and deported. Over 30 deaths in ICE detention centers were reported in 2025, and already there have been 11 deaths in the first 2.5 months of 2026. We are all seeing and experiencing that full-blown authoritarianism and fascism is really building power in the United States. And it's super powered by the tech industry that we, as tech workers here in Tech Workers Coalition, are giving our labor to. So I wanted to do a little level setting of historically how we got here in the US. Like, did this thing come out of nowhere? It did not. If you want to hop to the next slide. Um, so the tech industry has actually been profiting off of war and genocide since the industry started. Really notably, in the 20th century, IBM, International Business Machines, was actually a major logistics partner for the German Nazi regime. They facilitated punch card census data, military logistics, concentration camp statistics, and really operationalized genocide in Germany during World War II. And IBM also installed hardware and equipment in Saigon during the Vietnam War. And we know that Israel and the US have been ramping up their like AI-powered atrocities with Project Lavender, selecting sites to bomb in Gaza. And in the US, we have Project Maven, which is primarily powered by Anthropic's Claude LLM, like bombing schoolgirls in Iran. So clearly, the tech industry has never had qualms with profiting off of imperialism. And now, with the Department of War's ultimatum to Anthropic, let us surveil US citizens and build autonomous weapons, or we'll invoke the Defense Production Act and force you to do so. We're really seeing this tech imperialism genocide machine come to come home where the chickens roost. And the thing is, on the next slide, you can see that we have evidence that tech has actually already been surveilling us even before the whole Department of War, like, let us surveil you. We're actually already being surveilled by DHS. So publications like 404 Media have been doing really, really, really incredible reporting. Like, shout out to 404 Media. They've been doing great, incredible reporting on the details behind how this surveillance apparatus works. So tools like Tangles and Weblock are using commercial location data that's sold to data brokers from apps like Candy Crush and Tinder to track individuals' movements. And then companies like Palantir connect location data with license plate reader data from companies like Flock to follow someone across town. And then CBP is using facial recognition apps to confirm someone's identity, and then they can abduct this person. And even the skip tracing work where they track down targets. ICE is starting to contract AI companies to use LLM AI agents to automate that work instead of having a human do it. And this is all like really dystopian and terrible. But we know that, on the next slide, that the pillars of support of the regime are made up of the people who work in the tech industry. So can y'all drop in the chat if like you have an old classmate or a former coworker or maybe a friend of a friend who works for a government contractor, or maybe they're working for a company that's selling their user data to a data broker, or they're at a company whose ethical red lines are slipping every day. Like I definitely have. I grew up in Northern Virginia. Like so many of my college friends are government contractors, are working on really unsavory stuff. Um, and I know that my friends who maybe don't think that they have power because the strength of the pillars that are supporting the regime's deportation machine is in me and my friends who work in tech. And what we need to do to stop this deportation machine from being able to function is to stop cooperating. Um, their power is depending on us not speaking up, not looking into the company's contracts, to giving a pass to our friend who are working in government contracting or in defense manufacturing, in exchange for a paycheck, even though they're building a new surveillance state that's putting everyone at harm. So as tech workers, what we really need to be doing is stopping cooperation with these pillars that are propping up this surveillance machine. Yeah, former classmate working for Palantir. The college recruiting pipelines are the college students are so like such targets for these companies because you get a big fat paycheck and you have no idea about um, what is actually happening behind the scenes. Okay, so on the next slide, there's a bunch of different methods of non-cooperation. It's not just the rapid response that we might see on the streets every day that we see in the news. Like we don't necessarily have to go to the ICE detention center and like throw ourselves in front of a car. Like that is a extremely valid way of stopping the deportation machine, and it's really not the only way. Um, on the next slide, we can see, so we're actually going to hear from a couple of different tech workers who have been organizing against the ICE surveillance machine from three different perspectives. One of them is community rapid response, where, that's where you're showing up to ICE detention centers, or maybe you're blowing whistles, maybe you're doing patrols to make sure that folks know when ICE is around, and that's physically stopping or preventing abductions in our communities. The second method of non-cooperation we're going to talk about is getting the local government to divest. So this is your traditional community organizing where you're pushing city council, you're lobbying, you're doing rallies, you're doing demonstrations, you're doing protests, talking to council members to get them to pass legislation and do more oversight of what contracts they're signing, what contracts their police department is signing. Um, and getting your city council to ban surveillance infrastructure from getting built in the first place so that um, ICE and CBP aren't able to take advantage of this surveillance infrastructure for their own abduction purposes. And then the third method we want to talk about is company divestment. So a lot of some people in the chat have been talking about how their employers announce a partnership with Palantir. A lot of these really terrible companies that are propping up the surveillance machine have contracts with your company. Maybe they use Datadog for their, not to call out a specific company, but maybe, yeah, they will maybe use various third-party tools to perform their work. How can we, workers at maybe these secondary companies, uh, build campaigns to get our companies to divest? And how do we even know for a fact in the first place what contracts our companies are signing with who? We're going to learn about all of these three methods of non-cooperation from our panelists. So I would love to introduce our first panelist, Trevor, who's going to talk about community rapid response.
Hey everybody, my name is Trevor. I'm a tech worker and I'm also an organizer with the Puget Sound Tenants Union. Um, yeah, so if you haven't been reading the news, you might have seen that there's been a bunch of different community responses to ICE invasions in communities. For instance, in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Tenants Union has been on the ground fighting not only within homes to keep people safe, but also in the streets, physically putting bodies on the line. In Minnesota, what's it called? The Twin Cities Tenant Union was recently pushing for an eviction moratorium and also a freeze of the rent in their city. And these are not only like tactics that people use, but they're base building strategies. They're ways of connecting with the community. And so they happen a bit more door to door, knocking on people's doors, getting to know who is around you and who is in your neighborhood, because oftentimes the people who are the most vulnerable are people that you're not in contact with regularly. As well, the other side of the community response that we need to discuss, and that we are going to be having some people in the breakout rooms from Capybara Colectiva, are different migrant networks that have been kind of leading the ground in the actual rapid response numbers that people call, and the way that these kind of networks are organized to respond to ICE in the moment. And those happen to be along the lines of the IMA, International Migrants Alliance. Here in Seattle, the Capybara Colectiva, the International League of Filipino Struggle. Essentially, a lot of immigrant networks that end up kind of making the heart of the backbone of resistance right now. And yeah, I think that's about all I have to say, and I'll pass it off.
Thanks, Trevor, for sharing, what's happening on the ground. Um, Next up, we want to get a little intro from, I believe, Kieran is working on a deflock campaign in the Bay Area. Can you tell us a little bit about what flock is?
Yeah, so I'm part of the Tech Workers Coalition in the Bay Area. We have been working on a campaign starting last year around DFlock. So some of you might be familiar with Flock. Flock Safety is a surveillance company. It's a startup that has adopted the move fast and break things approach, which is kind of appalling considering what they're trying to sell you is supposedly safety. We know that what they're really selling is mass surveillance technology, and it's a loss of privacy that you can't opt out of. So Flock has a suite of increasingly invasive surveillance products, but they generally try to get you to buy into their lower tier product. And we're seeing these around the United States in cities and counties and states around the country. Uh, the product that they're selling is what's known as ALPRs, automated license plate recognition cameras. Basically, what they're doing is they store and capture license plate data and vehicle information for any car that's driving by without cause. There's no crime that's been reported. The car is not suspected of anything. They're just gathering the data. The data is preemptively stored to be potentially accessed later by your local law enforcement. So this is troubling as it is in terms of thinking about tech, the surveillance state. It's led to things like mistaken arrests, officers using Flock for personal vendettas, looking up the whereabouts of their ex-girlfriends and where they're traveling. But also because Flock has cameras across states and across the country, this data can also be accessed by agencies outside of your local city. So this isn't just speculative. We know that ICE has accessed Flock camera data in cities around the country. Flock keeps telling us that they don't work with ICE and they aren't stopping ICE from using their data. So this is happening. It's often happening actually in breach of local, state, and city contracts. So, for example, in Santa Cruz, which is near the Bay Area, Flock's database was accessed by ICE hundreds of times. And this is in direct violation to state law, which prohibits sharing of local information with outside agencies. But it's happening, and every time it happens, and it keeps happening, we're told that it was a one-time mistake. So, looking at what Flock is doing, we realized that it was a problem. We wanted to address it. So, what do you do about it? It's an issue that's come up in a lot of cities, so each city's approach is different. For us in the Bay Area, we focused specifically on Oakland because they had an existing contract that was coming up for renewal. So, what was really great about this campaign is it's something that's not just tech worker specific. It affects everyone in Oakland if you're just driving through Oakland, even. And so we were part of a broader coalition of organizations that was working together. And this allowed us to support the work of partner orgs that had already been doing this work for a while and also learn from them while kind of adding our perspective as tech workers. It really allowed us to also explore what unique things we can offer as tech workers. So, maybe as experts who understand the hardware and software that's powering these things, we can also show that as tech workers, as the people who build technology, that we're wary of it and for me personally, I think that's one of the really powerful things that we can offer as tech workers. It's a counter narrative to the idea that technology equals progress, right? If we say that we are the workers that make that technology and we have reservations, I think that that can create an opportunity to have a different conversation. So at the end of the day, the campaign that we ran was not successful at stopping the contract renewal. We can talk more about that in the panel discussion and in the breakout rooms. There's a lot of like messy politics that was going on behind it, but it was a really great learning experience. And it also, I think, showed us that we're not alone in the fight.
Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, there's lots of good questions about flock in the chat. We can do a little more explainers in the chat. And then the third speaker we want to have is Jack, who's going to tell us a little bit about how to do corporate research.
Yeah, so I left the tech industry about 7 years ago. I'd only been at Google for about 2.5 years. Before that, I was a math professor. But since then, I transitioned for a little while into kind of research and advocacy. And then about 4 years ago, just transitioned full time into investigative journalism, largely just because um, it's more of the kind of principles that I tend to want to uphold, source protection, intellectual independence, fairness, et cetera. And so a lot of my work has been on issues that are very relevant to this panel. Many of them aren't. I would say that, let's say researching companies like Penlink and Cobwebs, I've definitely published stories in the past, though much more so I focus on military and intelligence, and with a lot of special operations focus. And a lot of that, blends in. A good example of this would be a company named Orbital Insight, which no longer exists, maybe in small part because of some of the reporting that I did. They were kind of a spin out of the um, war in Afghanistan and something that you could call pattern of life analysis, which was how do you take like people's locations, for example, and they analyze where they move, and then from that find a way to maybe target them with a drone better. And, companies being companies want to figure out how can you extend that to much broader areas like, Unilever doing a program to do pattern of life analysis on its workers to figure out if they had forced labor in Indonesia, for example. But anyway, they were also doing a pretty big CBP contract, nominally for search and rescue, but that can be a bit funny with preventing people from immigrating. And so, as it turns out, that this company actually had a pretty big contract with Indonesia's state intelligence agency, basically their equivalent of the CIA. And in fact, while I was reporting all of this, Steve Wozniak, of all people, was helping to buy their company, which is one of the wildest kind of moments for me, given that, Wozniak like co-founded the EFF. Why is he helping like Indonesia's CIA surveil refugees, and like East Papuans, which they were. And so that was kind of a weird moment for me. I think of where everything kind of comes full circle. Another would be that if you look really deeply into the history of Project Maven, which you can actually analyze, at least historically, you could analyze in a lot of detail through public contracting records, particularly subcontracting records. Um, that, its Minotaur system, which was a kind of data fusion system really built for US Customs and Border Patrol to surveil overseas, was slowly actually became integrated into Project Maven, was one of the first data sources circa 2019. And that earlier system had been built, for example, by Johns Hopkins. Um, but I could probably go on forever, but what I would say my short pitch would be that there really isn't any single trick to doing deep investigations. I'd say really you need to creatively combine a lot of different data sources. Like tenacity is probably the most important thing, as well as an understanding on both the government and the corporate side. I think it's really that fusion of understanding like how the US government agencies break down in a hierarchy and where you can look up records and who leads those agencies and did they come from a company and rotate in and out. And then likewise, like understanding which new startups are in the space, which contracts exist, and then combining those two things, you can end up pretty powerful, especially if you're willing to call people up, submit freedom of information requests, and maybe drive somewhere and knock on a door or two, or attend a court case. So I'll kind of leave it there.
Thanks, Jack. All right. So, yeah, a part of the reason we wanted to do like a panel with like these three different perspectives is to kind of quell any assumptions or preconceptions that like there's one correct way to do organizing against surveillance and there's there's only one way to get involved, but actually there's so many different strategies, so many different angles. And so Gershom, also from Tech Workers Coalition, is actually gonna moderate a little discussion around like how is everyone
Yeah.
strategies comparing to trust.
So, before we get to that, I wanted to start with a specific question that I'm going to ask each of our speakers in turn, which is in different ways trying to get at because I know a lot of people are coming here and trying to figure out what can I do and how can I get started. And I want to make sure we answer that before we get into other stuff. And our speakers have also been answering in chat, and we'll have breakouts at the end where we can talk specifically with each of the speakers about different approaches. But like going down the line to give sort of an entryway, and these are not all calls to get involved in any one specific organization. There's strategies that different organizations in different cities are taking the lead in. But so, for example, starting with Trevor, if I, as a tech worker, said I want to go and get involved in this sort of on the ground ice watch type work. And I had located, right, which is the first step, like which organizations are the most active in my city and area. And I called one up, and I was like, "Hey, how can I get involved?" What would that look like typically? What would like the next steps be? How would they know to trust me? What would they have me start off doing? And what sort of activities might I get involved in?
Yeah, well, I'll start with that most rapid response communities out of necessity are going to be kind of layered. So you imagine you see ICE somewhere and there's a phone number set up for you to call to like report ICE, right? That's going to be like one layer. And then there's a layer that's going to like evaluate that call. And there's more layers that kind of dispatch people if that call seems genuine and it seems like, oh, we have to react to this, then there's another layer on top of that. And so when you're first getting involved, you're not going to be at kind of like this central, like you're making decisions kind of a thing. You're going to be in the lower layers where you're kind of just either going out and doing patrol or things like that. If you're in a tenant union, things that you're going to be doing right off the bat are going to be like knocking on doors or like going to people either in your community or seeing if other people are asking for help in their community, like assisting somebody to go walk along and talk to people in the street. One thing that they do often is like talking to vendors or small businesses that are in the area that have migrant workers or have people that ICE might want to like be interested in knocking on doors or disturbing people. And so you're going to be getting involved in a very, I don't know, the biggest step is really just kind of actually taking the initiative to reach out to the groups in the first place. That's what most people don't do. And so that's where the most bravery is. And you're not going to be thrown to the wolves and you're not going to be, fighting ICE the second that you call and start, trying to help.
Okay, that's a great answer. Yeah, so just demystifying it, that it's okay to just say, "Hey, how can I help?" And they'll have you answer some phones or post some flyers up, hand some stuff out, let people know who to contact, and you can learn to trust them, and they can learn to trust you. It's great. Karen, yeah, sort of similarly, if I know that my city, or if I want to know if my city is doing something, and if I want to figure out what's happening about it and how to get involved, what would that look like, and what would starting to get involved with that look like?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ongoing campaigns specifically around flock. I would say look for what's happening locally where you live. So throughout the Bay Area, there's different campaigns for each city. I know in a lot of other states, there's ongoing campaigns. There's also a lot of wins. I want to say Oakland, we didn't have a win, but across the country, there have been so many wins just in the past 6 months to the point where Flock is having to address this. So if you go on their website, there's like an FAQ of like why are so many cities canceling their Flock contracts? So we are really making a difference, and I think the tide is turning. So I would say look for what's happening locally where you are, and understand what they're trying to do and what the strategy is for that specific region. the best way to kind of do it, or what we found was helpful, was when there's already an opportunity for a contract renewal, or maybe they're considering installing Flock for the first time. But we've also been seeing, especially now that the connection with ICE has been really clear, cities actually like mid-contract say we're canceling Flock, or we're stopping the cameras even if we haven't taken them down. And so I think really putting emphasis on the danger that's being presented, because Flock is allowing ICE to access their data centers. There's also other tactics. There are areas like in Arizona, for instance, there's a number of cities that took down their Flock cameras around uh, privacy issues, right? So that's more speaking to people in that city. And you see a broad coalition of like more conservative and more liberal organizations coming together to say, hey, we don't want cameras installed in our cities. And so there's different ways that you can go about it. It will really depend on kind of your locality. But yeah, definitely look into what's happening locally, because a lot of this stuff is already moving and there's large organizations that are supporting it. So Jack mentioned EFF, that's one that has been strong anti-flock. ACLU has also been sort of anti-flock and has campaigns going in different regions. Um, so yeah, you don't have to necessarily start this on your own. If you do, it's a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. Filing for FOIAs, looking at the existing contracts, things like that. But there are organizations that are doing this work that you can plug into.
Okay, that's a great answer. So I will interject something on the workplace organizing side and then come to Jack. And actually, because Jack is here as a journalist and a researcher and a former tech worker. So through Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee and TWC, I've been helping to meet with and talk to various people doing workplace campaigns of various sorts about tech for ICE or tech for militarism, divestment, Palestine work elsewhere. I don't want to go into all the details of that here. I will say the two most important things are first, finding out what the issue is. And that's why Jack's here, is you got to know what your company's doing before you can convince people to organize against it. And number two, and it's not always so easy, but it's easier when you're inside than outside. And number two is finding a cohort of people that are co-thinkers in a discrete way that will be your organizing committee, because organizing is not a solitary occupation. It's a collective occupation. And I'm going to drop two links to Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee and No Tech for Apartheid, although it has been centrally about Palestine organizing, has been playing a role in helping with a lot of the anti-ICE workplace organizing as well. So they're good people to reach out to. But then I'm going to pose the question to Jack. Um, Now, and I know you've shared with me some very good resources in the past, and if you stall out, I'll share at least what you shared with me. But so say I'm at a big company and I want to know what are our government contracts and how deep does it go? How entangled are we with, say, ICE surveillance or activities or anything similar? What are the basic resources, like the two or three places that you start when you want to hunt something down that you would then recommend to somebody?
Yeah, so the first thing you have to be familiar with is even what are the subsidiaries of your company. There's a company, it was called Clarify, that contracted, for example, through another company. I think it was like Neural Net One. There's like Graphica that does something similar for its kind of counter disinformation research, where they use a completely different name for some of their government contracts. I think Okta, or I forget the details, but and then there's examples like Accenture, where they have a federal services subsidiary. So you have to think, well, do you even really consider that part of the company? Because I've had weird conversations with tech workers who think that a subsidiary isn't part of your company anymore. And so I would say that is just a baseline, is even know which keywords are you even looking for. But then there's the other question of where to go. Obviously, if you're looking for ICE contracts, let's say, then usaspending.gov is by far the best resource. So one of the simplest things you can do is just go to that website and download, in a custom award field, all contracts with, any contract with ICE in, let's say, fiscal year 2025, fiscal year 2026. It's actually not a huge data set. You could load that on your laptop and kind of just search through it in something like Vim or just load it into pandas and, go to town. Um, but if you want to start getting into some of the more obscure areas like military contracting through things that are outside of what's called the Federal Acquisition Regulation or the FAR, then you actually, that isn't in USA spending. And I know this sounds crazy, but literally more than $1 billion in military AI contracts were just deleted from public record after I reported on them. And many of those were through what's called an other transaction agreement. And in fact, other transaction agreements have been disappearing from easy public record kind of since the start of the second Trump administration. I did a bit of reporting at the beginning, like they started to lock it down and require a login.gov ID. Historically, you could just go to a site called the Federal Procurement Data System or fpds.gov, just like an old system set up by IBM, I want to say in the 90s. And that's actually to this day still the best system. There's been a bit of misleading reporting on that. Actually, their RSS feed actually still functions to this day. Even though if you go to fpds.gov just directly, it'll bounce you over to sam.gov, which is you can think of as a bit upstream. And so if, let's say, the government like ICE wants to contract with, let's say, Clearview AI, and they put out a solicitation, that's going to usually be on sam.gov. But once the contract's signed, one of the first places you'd find it would be on fpds.gov. That's gone now. And then a day later, it would be on usaspending.gov, except if it's an OTA, like a lot of these military AI contracts, and then it's nowhere. And so that's kind of an upsetting thing. Nominally, the other transaction agreements are supposed to be absorbed into sam.gov, but actually now it's heavily throttled. And so even if you have a login.gov ID, they only let you do 10 queries per day. And I think they limit it to something like 10 contract results per day. So it's just extremely, almost broken for doing any sort of mirroring system. So I've been in conversation with the Office of the Inspector General for the General Services Agreement for a few weeks, and they kind of just went cold. I would say other places to look that are very interesting, like Florida has very good public records. I found some wild stuff with them doing surveillance of Haitian migrants using Israeli stingrays through a company called Cognite. Years ago, you could just, they have a system called FACTS, like FACTS. You can easily find it. It's a very clunky system, but you can just do a query where you set the date range to like the last 6 months and no other queries, and you can just download a CSV of every contract they've had in the last 6 months, and then do whatever you want with that data, which is what I'd recommend doing. I mean, there's a lot more to this. I would say beyond contracts, really, the thing most journalists do is monitoring LinkedIn profiles of executives kind of a very large amount of the time. Executives are very chatty. I would say, one way to think of this is that, commerce continues, right? Like these are businesses, they're selling their wares and they have to pitch them and sell them. And so think of if you're a business and you have to sell your surveillance, how are you going to do that? Often it's at conferences. So actually about 4 years ago, I went and just attended as a vendor a sheriff's conference. And I didn't lie or anything. I just signed up and they let me attend. I guess they assumed I was a cop. And I just recorded everything, including Penlink, in fact, gave a presentation on how they do their wiretapping. And so, to be a bit cheeky, I was wiretapping the wiretappers. And actually, by the end, they had figured out that I just had my camera up, like literally recording everything, which, by the way, if you're just really assertive, people often look the other way. They demanded that I delete everything, and I didn't. But I got a very large amount of very interesting information out of that. After that, Penlink ended up buying Cobwebs, which is this Israeli kind of open source surveillance firm. Somebody leaked to me a copy of actually the training materials Cobwebs was giving to like US police to like train them on how to surveil like Black Lives Matter, Antifa. Actually, January 6th is who they pivoted to after surveilling BLM and Antifa. So, that's kind of interesting. But I would say, a lot of them, some of the more interesting insights are very interagency. So a good example on this front is Penlink. One of their senior executives is a guy named Derek Maltz, who was actually the acting director of the DEA at the beginning of the second Trump administration. He'd been head of what's called the Special Operations Division of the DEA prior to that, which if anybody isn't familiar with that, it's one of the most you know, incredible in terms of the types of things it does organizations. It basically sets up international wiretapping partnerships around the world. They were largely responsible, got a lot of the credit for like the raid that captured Maduro. They have tried to smear all kinds of international organizations as drug traffickers, specifically for US propaganda purposes. And they work very closely with, all the agencies you're probably interested in as well. They were only set up in like 1994. But anyway, just is one example of where things can get a bit wild. And in fact, Derek Maltz in a recent court case was accused from a former DEA agent, very high level, that tried to launder money for what he thought was the CJNG in Mexico. That Derek Maltz was actually in on it from their time in New York. And that's a pretty senior Penlink exec to this day.
Okay.
Maltz didn't respond to a request for comment on that, of course, but and to be clear, that could have been made up. But I would say, do not underestimate how wild things get in court cases and how easy it is to just follow what's going on in courts.
This is great stuff. I think we need to spread out some of the discussion, even though the stuff Jack is talking about, I think, is very pertinent, especially as it pertains to sort of drug enforcement and sort of broader U.S. imperial interests as having developed a lot of this stuff over decades and decades. Uh, Maybe another question to pivot back to Trevor on and is we want to talk about how this stuff might tie together. I'm also going to encourage people to just drop questions in chat at this point, and I'll try to ask those as well. Is And I think everyone's talked about this a little bit, but how has being a tech worker or being at which maybe not directly in your job, but like having certain proficiency and coming from a certain place affected how you have or haven't been able to sort of do your organizing? And also to what extent is sort of this broader strategic research or civil research about surveillance technology and who's funding it or how it's being deployed affecting that sort of on the ground organizing, Trevor?
Yeah, well, I'll say that for my work in the tenant union, not a lot transfers of being a tech worker. A lot of it's social skills and it's stuff that anybody can do. My sources are telling me that some people from Capybara Collectiva are here. Alejandro, if you'd like to talk a little bit about the second part of the question, kind of what kind of sources go into rapid response?
Yeah. So hi guys, my name's Wandro. I'm part of Capybara Collectiva. So we're an anti-imperialistic grassroots militant group. And our focus is to support the community, the migrants in our community. So that means like rapid response, visitation visits, even accompaniments. And I think to answer your question as well about like how do tech skills transfer over, I would say they don't. I think tech is tech at the end of the day. Most of the work that goes into rapid response is going to be interacting with your community members. Like these migrants that you're going to be working with or trying to engage with probably don't really have an understanding of tech. They're more, it's going to be a lot of social skills because you want to look, our main focus is to get connected with as many migrants as we can in our community. So right now in the Seattle region, we've been fortunate enough to work with a lot of Venezuelan migrants. We also work with a lot of Angolan migrants, as well as we're connected with a lot of Filipino migrants. So within that work, our main effort is just to ensure we're protecting these migrants because they're very vulnerable. I think an example of like waste surveillance is impacting these migrants is recently in the past year, When the ice rate started ramping up, we were hearing stories of migrants getting picked up from Walmarts. So a migrant would be going to the shop, they're leaving the store. Next thing you know, you have these group of ICE agents coming over and kind of like abducting them essentially. And a lot of times these are like very similar stories that we hear to like people's cars windows getting smashed in. And I think that's where the rapid response comes into play. Here in Washington, we're fortunate that we have this org goes by WASN. They are the ones who coordinate a lot of the rapid response. So usually a member of the community would call them, and then they would dispatch the other members to go out and try to like act quickly. But also another form of rapid response that we've been seeing is like within the local communities here in Seattle, like based off neighborhood, especially like North Seattle, you don't really have as much migrants compared to the southern parts of Seattle. So in like Beacon Hill or down south of Seattle, you're going to have different rapid response groups formed via the community. And as these groups get bigger, you become more connected and people become aware of these groups that have formed. I think an example of this that really showed how these community groups impacted was, I think, recently down in Beacon Hill, there was ICE patrolling the elementary schools. Luckily, the principal at one of the schools is very connected to some of our community members, reached out to us, and we quickly uh, gathered a group of people and went down to the elementary school areas, and we're just walking around, keeping an eye out for ICE. We're not necessarily looking to instigate, we're mostly looking to ensure like um, if more ICE members were to show up, we're quickly able to get more people to come out and better support the efforts. Does that answer your question? I know I kind of rambled a little bit.
No, that's all really great. I think one more question maybe to pose then would be, uh, to what extent are people able to take their experiences doing this work and supporting immigrants and targets of ICE of all sorts, and uh, translate that back to other arenas of their life, like say their workplace, to activate coworkers and mobilize them and you know, sort of create a broader consciousness in other arenas that they're involved in, and you know, therefore, like hopefully trigger other things in other places too.
Yeah, I think that's a big effort that is just informing people of like these opportunities to join in and get involved. Um, yeah, I think the more people you inform, the more people you're going to be able to get to support your efforts. And I do think like even though like as tech workers we do have a lot of valuable skills when it comes to technology. I'm not to say like those aren't invaluable, but I do think if you apply yourself correctly, you could be play a very supportive role for a lot of migrants. 'Cause, at the end of the day, migrants do have to deal with a lot of like inability to read out forms or even to communicate with other people. So that's something that you can also apply your skills to.
Cool. So
Trevor,
Trevor,
yeah, Trevor
got
has
your
his
hand
hand
up.
up.
You want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to say that the exact same tools on like just having conversations with people, especially about things that are scary, like transfers one to one, like from talking to somebody like in your neighborhood to talking to somebody at your workplace. Because a lot of these things, even for the people that are like being targeted by ICE, even for people that are like have a lot of risk on them, it's often not a thing that you want to think about. It's not a thing that you want to like talk about very often. So like one of the classic organizing techniques is like getting people to talk about the things that are actually agitating them and getting people to like, oh, this thing, this like big geopolitical international, war and all these things that are going on, like how does that actually impact you? And would you be willing to do something about it? Would you be willing to help your neighbors? Would you be willing to like be a part of a network of rapid response? Like the way that you build relationships is kind of the same no matter where you are. And so I do think there is a lot of transfer there, 100%.
That is, yes, such a great answer, and I definitely want to say that in my experience with different workplace organizing committees, the people that have some background in tenant organizing have, they've known how to run a meeting, they've known how to talk to people, and they've been like stalwarts that can really hold it down. So I've definitely seen that. Maybe Karen, I want to throw sort of variants of those two questions at you, and I also want to encourage panelists want to get on Stack to like ask each other to respond to one another too, and in any other way you'd like, because I know you all are throwing out good stuff there, and you have a lot of lot to say. But otherwise, Kieran, yeah, first you talked about this maybe a bit more about how people who work in the industry to some degree and can speak with that expertise are able to play a certain role. And yeah, maybe you could talk a bit more about that and sort of what that's looked like and why that's been useful. And I'll also add that in San Diego for a long time, it's been tech workers who have been playing a large role in TWC in a lot of the efforts against border drones and border surveillance. I think for similar reasons that they just understand what's happening in maybe a bit more detail.
Yeah, I think there's two aspects to it. So there's folks in tech who are technical, right? And they're able to understand these products in a way that the layperson isn't. And so being able to explain why, like the hardware has issues or the way that things are set up on the back end can lead to data breaches and things like that. Being able to explain that as a tech worker, being able to understand it as a tech worker and then explain it, I think adds a lot of credibility and again adds a unique aspect that other groups and other organizations might not be able to offer. And then also, as somebody who's a non-technical tech worker like myself, I work in finance, but I work in tech. There's still a lot that you can bring, I think, things like data analysis, being able to think about strategy, even just sort of, I think Trevor mentioned this, but like knowing how to like organize things, how to run meetings, how to have conversations with people, all of that stuff is skills that you can bring to organizing. And so it might be that you're new to organizing, but that doesn't mean that you don't have skills or things that you can offer. And it's really once you get started that you start to see those ways where you can like overlap and contribute. There's even, if you work in marketing, you could help with maybe the social media and communication aspects of it. If you work in finance, maybe you could help with looking in the budgets. If you're a lawyer, you can help look through contracts. There's really a lot of uh, overlap and things that you can offer. And I think once folks get into the work, that stuff comes out. But when I spoke to other organizations, they were really excited about the prospect of having tech workers come in and speak as tech workers and be able to be experts in the technology who can explain to you why it's problematic and why they don't want cities to use it.
Okay, that's really helpful answer. And trying to think if there's another aspect. I mean, I think in some ways you talked, or the connections to research are almost too obvious to need to explore. And I think some of the tools Jack talked about are great. And then also, you would probably say every city has its own way that it reports its budget, right? So if I want to find out what my city's doing, I got to find out how they do it, and it could vary widely.
Yeah, and I think it's really cool because, I didn't know how to file for a FOIA before. So I learned that from people like Jack, and then you apply it and you get the data, and then you're like, oh, okay, I know what to do with this data. And so you're learning these new skills. You're interacting with others, you're getting to learn from them and expand your own skill set. And then you're also able to bring your expertise and your perspective to it as well.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. Do any of the panelists want to respond to one another on any of these topics in various ways? Or if not, I can also pose to Jack first is, are there folks that have reached out to you? You described having people leak to you. Are there folks that have reached out to you because they're involved in different efforts where you feel you've been able to help them or give them pointers in the past? Or do you just try to keep your reporting high level and just call them as you see them?
I mean, in terms of help, I don't really see that as the job of the journalist. There are like dedicated whistleblower support organizations that exist along those lines. You know, actually, a kind of interesting case was a former special operator who'd worked. I'll just leave it at a very large tech company you all know the name of. And actually, what they found so weird is that they thought that what this tech company was doing was so much more unethical that anything they did in the military, even in this like elite special operations unit. And so they really wanted me to, report on all of these things this tech company was doing kind of fraudulently. I mean, so that sort of thing definitely happens. You could ask the question of if that's scratching their itch, so to speak. But um, yeah, I mean, it's not as clear of a let's say give and take journalistically. I mean, I would say where things can maybe coincide more with organizing. There was a FOIA that I submitted 2021. I want to say I got it back in 2022, and it was on something completely unrelated. And it just happened to show that this contractor, Thundercat Technology, was was selling Google Cloud and promising that they were going to surveil immigrants through the Anduril thermal imagery that they were that Anduril had collected. They were going to process that on Google Cloud, and then that was being sold to, I think, CBP. And that actually created a pretty large uproar within Google. It was kind of wild because the head of Google Cloud actually convened a town hall and denied it all. And then years later, it was just all overwhelmingly showed through public documents. It was all true. And so, a colleague of mine, Sam Biddle at The Intercept, did some great reporting on this system. And so I would say maybe that's one side of things is like, how do you respond when execs lie to you? And I think journalists are kind of the sharp end of moving upstream of lies, even when it's a very high level lie like that. And of course, tech workers with access to documents can do the same thing internally. And, maybe journalists can help expose it externally, and then it can feed back in.
So that's okay. So actually, let me pose two more questions there, and then again, I'm sort of going where my instincts take me, but we got some other questions in chat maybe we can get to, and also again, I want to encourage panelists to respond to each other. So really quick, two questions would be number one, are there any, you mentioned whistleblower support orgs, are there, if you just want to name a couple that, without endorsing them, that you think have done useful work, or I think that might be interesting to people. And number two, um, we've seen actually, and I'll mention this, a number of the campaigns that are internal campaigns recently, like for example at Salesforce and now at Thomson Reuters, about ICE have and contracts with ICE or support to it have made themselves public through leaks to reporters, and I think that's been a very effective tactic on their part. And if you had any advice for people that like if they had like and you're not necessarily reporting on that sort of stuff, you do investigative security stuff, but any advice for people on how to like if they're like, yeah, we want to go public through a reporter, any advice for like how they would start to think about that?
Well, first of all, in terms of your question of whistleblower support organizations, there are quite a few of them. The one that I had worked closely with in the past was Signals Network. In fact, they organized at least one event with TWC in New York, I want to say years ago. And so that's a great, very selfless organization. In terms of the whistleblowing process, obviously there's a wide spectrum there. It depends. I think people need to ask themselves really hard as to what your actual goal is. I would say on one end of the spectrum, there is the anonymous whistleblower where you provide a document and you go about your day and you don't expect your name to end up in the news. There's maybe something in the middle where you're okay providing a quote. And then there's the other end where you just kind of go full whistleblower and you kind of just, it's almost can become like a brand for you. And that can get really ugly in some ways. And so I would say kind of, the question is where you, like, what is your goal? Are you just trying to expose information or do you want to use this as like a vehicle for your own activism? And all of these are fine. I just think it's good to be kind of figure that out a priori because I think a lot of the conversations might just be, how do you do it most securely, right? Like, do you use Signal? Do you use Secure Drop? Whatever. I mean, but I think there's just the simpler question of what do you even want out of this process? And like what sort of coverage do you want to exist?
Uh, okay, so now I'm going to answer a question in my Ewok capacity and maybe answer this a bit too. Which is someone asks, is there any path forward, especially for workers at party companies being used, for tech workers to unionize and to push their companies that way? And the answer is absolutely yes. There's a real connection. Did I cut out?
You're good. Keep going.
Am I back?
You're good. Yeah.
Sorry. There's a real connection between t- uh, uh, organizing around like social issues at your company, its connections to ICE and so on, and union organizing. Unions like Alphabet Workers Union came out of people who were organizing around Me Too and then about really bad government contracts and other issues. And they said, well, if we want to keep this going, we need to unionize. And they reached out to CWA, and they did. And Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee is there to help you do that. So it's not one or the other. They're really interconnected. As part of that, one of the things I was getting to is a lot of the campaigns now that are happening have a much broader reach because, you know, for a lot of people that might feel their pay is okay or whatever, maybe these days less so, they feel more insecure, they but they care about these other issues. And so organizing around ICE, which everyone feels is super urgent, gets you a broad reach. And then with that, you have that issue, but you also decide you need protections and it develops from there. And the tactic I'm describing that's been used by a couple of these campaigns has been that they do an internal petition campaign using largely sort of sub rosa techniques, right? So that the boss doesn't know it's coming. Sometimes they've been very public, right? Because someone starts complaining and everyone gets mad in the company Slack, and then it just takes off and catches fire. But then they still pull together. They want to be placed in. And that can often be like if you're in San Francisco or somewhere, you look for the local paper that you want to cover you. Or if you're in Washington, you look for the local paper and you look at who the reporters are writing the articles that are like the article you want written about the thing that you think you're doing that's news. And that's how you pick, oh, that looks like the right reporter to reach out to. And then you reach out to them, you say, hey, we're doing this thing. We want you to report on it. We have like 1,000 people who have signed this thing and given it to management. And then that puts the external pressure, and it also lets people at the company that you didn't reach one to one know. So that's a sort of good hybrid tactic, and it's not opposed to union organizing. Sometimes the core of people that will do that will say, we also want a union. There's a lot of ways it can go. Do you want to mention that? Karen, you had your hand up, so I'm going to toss it to you.
Yeah, I don't know how we're doing on time, but I was just curious to ask Jack, like, from the perspective of a journalist, are there things that are like, I don't know, would be like interesting or generate headlines that tech workers can be doing to bring attention to the issues they're organizing around?
I think genuine grassroots uprisings, there's always a hunger for people to report on that. I mean, if I'm being honest, my intense skepticism of these headlines that have just been, dominating the last month on like Anthropic, et cetera, is that it's just very clearly driven by the executives at these companies, whether it's the CEO of Anthropic or Brad Smith over at Microsoft now. What does that have to do with labor? I don't think it has anything to do with labor once the CEOs are in control. And so frankly, I kind of just want to report the opposite of whatever that campaign is kind of instinctively because I know it's not grassroots. It's cynical PR. And so I would say anything where it's clear people are actually taking a stand and like building power, I think is interesting. I'm not necessarily, labor isn't my central beat. There are a lot of other journalists that do that much better. But I'm for sure always interested in documents. Like what is your company doing to suppress labor organizing? I think is always a fascinating topic. I've definitely covered in the past, the way that even the US intelligence community proposes building up the HR systems within companies as tools to monitor so-called insider threats. You can find pretty senior, like Defense Intelligence Agency case officers that run entire businesses just setting up insider threat programs within tech companies. Like Uber, for example, was set up by a particular former DIA case officer. And so I think that kind of internal counterintelligence system within big tech companies gets way less coverage than it probably deserves. And hint, hint, HR is right at the middle of it. Because that's really the CEO's like early warning system, so to speak. And so yeah, that would be my take on kind of the labor beat that I don't think other people are doing.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks for sharing.
That's this is all great. We're coming up on yeah, that's a great time check. So I'm gonna leave it open once more for drop a question in chat, raise your hand, or otherwise make yourself known. Otherwise, we can do breakouts, and we're gonna have one breakout per basically per topic, and then one general TWC breakout. And so if you just want to talk about getting involved in tech work or organizing generally, so yeah.
Yeah,
How
I
about
can take
Crystal
it.
take it away?
Yeah, so one thing I actually wanted to add is really emphasizing the overlap between and just kind of the commonalities between tenant organizing, between rapid response organizing on the ground, between community organizing, local government. In all of these contexts, labor organizing in your workplace, in all of these contexts, you have a bunch of people and you have someone in power and you have something that you want to change. And the basics of organizing is you get all of the people in power to agree loudly enough that the people in power who have the decision-making power feel threatened. And they're like, oh my God, okay, if I don't make the different decision, then like they're gonna shut down the industry, they're gonna shut down the streets, they're gonna like I'm gonna lose my elected position. Um, Fundamentally in the US, if we're as long as we're still in a democracy, which, is slipping day by day, and there are lots of other ways to that's a whole nother discussion. Um, Fundamentally, we are in contexts where people have power, and even in authoritarian contexts, the people still have the power. Um, so the takeaway I want to take from all of these different conversations is in any context you're in, finding allies and then finding what issue you want to change, and then coming up with strategies of like how can I put pressure on the decision maker to get them to make a different decision by all of us making a fuss and then getting as many more people joining us. That's just the fundamentals of organizing, whether you're doing it at a community level, whether you're doing it at with your government or at the workplace. I also want to drop a couple of miscellaneous things here about how having a union at the workplace is also really incredible for defending immigrants and defending against ICE. The TWC wrote a blog post around this time last year, actually, talking about the H-1B visas and the tech industry. And one of the examples that I really love from that is how the New York Times Tech Guild, when they went on strike in November 2024, there were a lot of H-1B workers who were, at extra we're undergoing extra risk to do the strike, and how the workers who were citizens made a pledge to say, if anything happens to these H-1B workers, if anything happens to my coworkers, we are all going to XYZ threat, which both made the H-1B worker coworkers feel a lot more safe and also increased everyone's power and everyone's solidarity with each other because everyone knew that we were really in it together. And just like taking that sort of solidarity and lesson and bringing it to all organizing is that attitude we need to build in the tech worker movement, because that's the only way we're going to be able to turn this industry around and create a future that works for us, Um, so breakout rooms. Um, Tech workers, the beautiful person running the slides. Could you put the slides back up? Um, So in the last like 20 minutes or so, this is, we're going to stop the recording once we start breakouts. But if folks are interested in learning more about each of these specific topics, whether rapid response from Trevor, whether deflock campaigns from actually Navi from Bay Area, and or research from Jack, then we're going to open breakouts. And then the fourth one will be just joining TWC and learning about Tech Workers Coalition. So yeah, we do have breakouts ready to open? And I guess as that happens, something I wanted to share, a couple of calls to action. Um, so what you can do right now, if you're not going to go to breakouts, is you can take a bunch of actions, like finding your local rapid response hub, finding a local deflock campaign, starting a divestment campaign in your workplace, or joining Tech Workers Coalition. I know I'm asking tech to do a lot of things at the same time, so I'm going to drop everything. We have a feedback form for this event in case you would be so kind as to help us improve events like this in the future. Um, please feel free to fill out the jot form. The Tech Workers Coalition join link is also dropped in the chat, and then we have a couple of extra links like Jack's Substack, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, etc. So yeah, how are we doing our breakouts? Breakout rooms are open. So
Stop recording.
yeah, let's stop the recording. I can do that. Stop.